With a starting price just under $34,000, the A-Class is the least expensive Mercedes available in America, and today I'm taking a look at the least expensive AMG variant, which is the A35. This is also the least expensive AMG period in North America. But you should know that even though the starting price of this AMG model is just under $46,000, as I'm testing it today, this came in at $57,890. That means that this particular AMG A35 is in the price range of 11 different Mercedes models, including the C43 AMG. And this particular A35 doesn't have all the options on it. It is missing, most importantly, features like lane centering, radar adaptive cruise control, and a number of features that are available on the A-Class. Mercedes is slicing their pie very thinly these days. The A-Class may be the least expensive Mercedes, but there are 3 other entry-level Mercedes depending on how you want to look at this. We also have the very closely related Mercedes-Benz CLA. It has a slightly angrier front end, and it is a little bit longer on the outside, but not longer on the inside. We also have the GLA and GLB if you prefer more of an upright crossover or hatchback vibe. When it comes to pricing, all 4 of these options have very significant pricing overlap, and all of them have AMG variants as well. Things are a little bit different in the A-Class than the CLA in the United States, however, because we do not get the A45 here. If you want an affordable 4-door Mercedes with about 300 horsepower, then we have 2 options, this and the CLA. But if you want nearly 400 horsepower, the CLA is your only option. Going in for a closer look, we have full LED headlights and a lot of functional vents. The vents down below the headlights are fully functional. They help direct air around the front tires. The grille changes based on the version of the A-Class that you're looking at. This again is the A35, so we have a more aggressive sporty grille right there, and definitely a lot of cooling going on above and below that red portion of the bumper. At just over 179 inches long, the A-Class is 5 inches shorter than the CLA. Even though the 2 vehicles are very closely related, they're going after a different customer. So when we take a look at the doors in the A-Class, they have complete sills around them. It's not the frameless design that we see in the CLA. We don't have the sport back-like profile that we find in the CLA either. The front end is pretty similar. Most of the change happens right back here, where this has more of a traditional sedan profile. Depending on where you're shopping for an A-Class around the world, you may also have access to the hatchback variant of the A-Class. Obviously, that's going to be pretty different than the CLA, but in the United States, we don't get that version. Honestly, I think that's an incredible pity because the hottest hatch in the world right now is a Mercedes-Benz A-Class, the A45S. Over 400 horsepower and all-wheel drive in basically the same vehicle with a hatch. This may be the baby AMG, but it has some pretty serious performance credentials. 0 to 60 happens well under 5 seconds, and 60 to 0 happens in under 110 feet. Those are numbers that would be excellent in the compact sedan category, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the CLA is pretty light. It also has nice wide tires. These are 235/35 series tires, so there's really not a lot of cushion going on there. And as you can see in here, we have absolutely massive ventilated brakes on this model. Let me know what you think about the look of the A-Class down there in the comment section. I like this look better than what we see in the CLA. The CLA does get a longer trunk lid and a longer rear end after the rear wheels, but I think that the A-Class looks better proportioned. This looks more like a Mercedes-Benz C-Class and E-Class, etc. And we also don't get the odd bumper inserts that are required in the CLA because the license plate is lower on the bumper, and according to Mercedes, they had to do that for federal crash regulations. Because Mercedes chose to put the license plate up here on the trunk lid in the A-Class, this looks almost identical to the European version, except of course for the turn signals, which are red in North America rather than amber. At the bottom of the bumper, we find large dual exhausts and again, fully functional aero treatments right down there at the bottom. Under the hood of the 35 series AMGs, we find a mainly machine-assembled 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. That's a little bit different than we find in the CLA 45 or in Europe in the A45, where we get a hand-assembled 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. Obviously, the engines are all related under this hood. Things will start out with the base tune of this engine, producing 188 horsepower and 221 pound-feet of torque. This engine bumps things up to 302 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. If you get the CLA 45 AMG in America, the only 4-door sedan-like Mercedes with that engine in it, things will go up to 382 horsepower and 354 pound-feet of torque. And then if you get the AMG 45S version of that in Europe, then it will go over 415 horsepower. As with the rest of the entry-level Mercedes models in America, this engine is mated only to a dual-clutch transmission. In this vehicle, it's a 7-speed dual-clutch, which is a little bit different than we find in something like the Mercedes-Benz GLB or the top-end version of the CLA, which use an 8-speed DCT. This is the older transmission design for Mercedes-Benz front-wheel drive-based models. Mercedes has made some software adjustments to this transmission over time, but it isn't quite as smooth as the new 8-speed DCT that we find in some of the other Mercedes models. Fuel economy is, however, pretty high at 27 miles per gallon combined. This is in the same segment as the Acura ILX, which is one of the sales leaders in this segment. The Lexus UX, theoretically, even though that is a hatchback. Also, obviously, the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe, that is the closest competitor in my mind to the Mercedes-Benz A-Class. And then the Audi A3 and S3. But an important thing to keep in mind is that the A3 and S3 are taking 2021 off. They had a 2020 model year. 2022, we're going to be getting a brand new A3. So for this model year, there actually is no Audi counterpart. On the other hand, if you want a good deal on an A3 or an S3, you may want to act fast because dealers are probably going to be wheeling and dealing on the last model year vehicles. Now, when it comes to performance variants, there are even fewer options because there's no performance variant of the ILX or the UX. That means that this A35 for 2021 has exactly 2 direct competitors. We have the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe, obviously a very, very direct competitor to this, and then we have the Cadillac CT4V. But the CT4V is quite different. Not only is it externally a full step larger than this, although on the inside it's almost exactly the same size, it's also the only rear-wheel drive entry in this segment. It's priced very, very similarly to the A-Class, and that's why Cadillac is calling it a competitor to this and not the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Front seat comfort is not too far removed from the CLA that I drove not too long ago. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a power driver's seat with 3-position memory. We also have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. There are a few variances in terms of the interior dimensions between the A and the CLA. Headroom in the back is the biggest of those differences, however. Up front, we have a very similar passenger accommodation. A problem I also noted in the BMW 2 Series, headroom is definitely at a premium in this vehicle. Now, this does have a panoramic moonroof, but if I'm sitting comfortably in this seat in the position that I would want to be in, which is a little bit more upright, then my head does end up touching the ceiling. So keep that in mind if you're a taller driver. Hopping into the back seat, we have the same kind of legroom that we find in the Mercedes CLA. With the front seats adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about 2 inches of legroom left, but I really can't even get over here in the passenger seat. The front seat's all the way back in its tracks for a taller person up front, and the seat back is almost touching the front of the rear seats. Bear in mind that the A-Class and the CLA are both subcompact luxury vehicles. So in terms of interior dimensions, most of the dimensions going on in here are going to be smaller than something like a Corolla or a Civic. Headroom is definitely more generous in the A-Class thanks to the sedan-like profile, however. I can actually put my head back here on the headrest. I do have to duck down a little bit. It's not the most comfortable position. If I try and sit upright, my head does touch the ceiling, but this is significantly more comfortable than the CLA. If you're planning on putting any adults in the back of your next compact Mercedes, you should definitely look at the A-Class over that CLA. If you're looking for the most headroom at the moment, the A3 does have a little bit more headroom in the rear, but I don't know what the next generation A3 is going to bring us. According to the spec sheet, behind this trunk lid we find 8.6 cubic feet of cargo space. But to be perfectly honest, that number doesn't seem right. It seems like this cargo area is a little bit bigger. I've reached out to Mercedes for an explanation of this. They haven't gotten back to me just yet. But some of Mercedes cargo numbers have been a little bit off because of the way they've been translated from Europe to North America standards, so I suspect this may be a little bit larger in reality. I was able to fit exactly the same number of roller bags in here as I was able to in the CLA, even though the CLA is notably larger on the spec sheet, over 11 cubic feet in that model. Now don't get me wrong, this trunk isn't enormous, I just don't think it's quite as small as the numbers would indicate. If we look under the load floor, we find the Canna-Fix-A-Flat tire inflator, no spare tire. This is also where we find the subwoofer and a tiny bit of extra storage room. This is also where we find the amplifiers for the audio system. In the Alex & Auto's exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I give this cargo area 6 out of 10 points. This is certainly smaller than a wide number of vehicles that you could buy for the same amount of cash that you'd pay for the A35. But we do have a number of nice touches. There's a helper handle to help you close the trunk lid. The rear seats release from here in the cargo area, and we have a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. As you know, I'm a big fan of 40-20-40 folding seat backs because they're an awful lot more practical than simple 60-40 designs. However, keep in mind this is a small vehicle, so this pass-through here is an awful lot smaller than anything you'll find in bigger Mercedes models. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are not in a fully loaded version, so obviously there are going to be a few things you'll find if you check all of the option boxes. We have a pretty large panoramic moonroof that goes to well over the driver and front passengers' heads, but you can see it doesn't go all the way to the back seats. The driver and front passenger get fixed height shoulder belts and four-way adjustable headrests. One of the things I really like about Mercedes' modern vehicle lineup is that there is a ton of customization available. There are a ton of different upholstery choices, different leather grades available, tons of different color choices as well. Rather unfortunately, they always seem to send me black on black vehicles. We have the extending thigh cushion right there for the driver and front passenger. Moving over to the front doors, there's a high percentage of soft touch materials, but you will find some harder plastics down at the bottom of the door, just as you'd expect in an entry-level vehicle. Real wood trim is available in the A-Class, but this model has aluminum trim on the doors and dashboard. And you can see that purple line above the aluminum trim is the ambient lighting strip. It's in the color wheel mode, so it's constantly color changing. There are a ton of different modes for the ambient lighting setup in modern Mercedes models, and the A-Class doesn't really get reduced in terms of its functionality versus those more expensive models. This vehicle does have the optional Burmester audio system, so you can see we have the little logo right there on those speakers in the A-pillar. We have a very distinctive dashboard layout reminiscent of the larger Mercedes models with the similar air vents that we find going on in some of those larger, more expensive Mercedes models. Again, tons of different trim options to choose from, so if you're not a big fan of this AMG logo and stripe thing going on here on the dashboard, personally, I'm not a huge fan of that look right there. You obviously don't have to get that if you don't want to. A lot of soft touch materials going on here. As we move on over to the main portion of the dashboard, we find the classic Mercedes dual screen setup that we see across the Mercedes lineup, although with slightly smaller screens in a vehicle like the A-Class versus obviously something like the S-Class. One thing I've noted before is that smartphone integration only occupies a very small portion of the touchscreen infotainment system. The main reason for that is that if you're on the driver's side looking over there, the steering wheel can actually cover this leftmost portion of the screen because the two LCDs are pretty close together. That's probably why Mercedes chose to do this. This is absolutely not an Apple thing. This is a Mercedes thing, although obviously they could have shifted it over to the right side and used this right side of the screen for CarPlay integration as well. Even though the A-Class is the least expensive vehicle in the lineup, this gets Mercedes' most recent MBUX infotainment software, so this definitely looks like the rest of the Mercedes lineup. Again, you don't really get cheaper things just because you're in the least expensive vehicle. Below the infotainment system, we find three large air vents with ambient lighting and definitely sort of a jet engine theme going on in there. Physical controls for the climate control system, very similar to what we find in the rest of the Mercedes lineup. A large storage area there. There is no lid in this particular model. Definitely roomy enough to accommodate some of those larger smartphones, as you can see. And that's fortunate because the only smartphone integration jack for that infotainment system is right here in the dashboard. I think that's kind of an odd place. I wish it had been tucked away somewhere else. We have two pretty decently sized cup holders here, and then the controls for the MBUX infotainment system with the Mercedes-Benz touchpad. This is not my favorite input method for an infotainment system, but this is a touchscreen infotainment system, so you don't have to use this if you don't want to. There are actually three different input methods. You can use this touchpad, you can touch the screen itself, just stab the option you want right there, or you can use this little touch-sensitive control on the steering wheel that reminds me an awful lot of 1990s Blackberries. To the left of the infotainment controller, we find the drive mode selector knob that allows you to choose between 5 different drive modes. We have a car option direct access button that takes you over to the vehicle settings in the infotainment system. There's a manual mode engage, disengage button over here, stability and traction control, and then a 2-mode button setting for the optional adaptive dampers. That's definitely an option that I would get. Between the front seats, we find a padded center armrest. It opens in a bifold fashion right like that. There's a USB charge-only port inside. With the camera positioned approximately where it would be while driving, you can definitely see that the leftmost portion of that infotainment screen is obscured by the steering wheel. I didn't find that to be too much of a problem because if I'm digging around with options, you can always lean a little bit over to the right to actually take a look at those options. And the most commonly used functions use primarily the center of the display. On the steering wheel, we have not just one, but 2 different touchpad controllers. This one on the right side controls the infotainment system. The one on the left side controls the LCD instrument cluster. They become quite intuitive after you've used them for a while. In my opinion, the software controlling this display is not quite as intuitive to use as the display software that we find in modern Audi models. However, this display arguably offers an awful lot more customization as far as the look goes. You can get a very traditional sport look, you can get that progressive look that we saw there before. And if you want an understated theme, which definitely is understated since it turns off the infotainment system, you can get this look as well. Depending on the display mode that you're in, either 2 or 3 portions of this display are further customizable. So you can see we have a ton of different options to choose from over there inside that speedometer readout. If I move over to the middle, I can choose instead to see things like the vehicle assistance readout, so you can see the system's been suspended there. You can see distance to the leading vehicle. You can also go over to the right side display, which would normally house the tachometer, and get a number of different display readouts in there as well. Moving out from there, we have an absolutely excellent 3-spoke steering wheel. It has a split bottom spoke right there. Paddle shifters on the back. They're definitely large and easy to find. Up on the right and then down on the left. There's some pretty aggressive sport grips. It's definitely thickly rimmed, and then we have pretty flat sides and then a flat bottom as well. One thing I'm honestly not the biggest fan of is the column shifter. We see this in a number of Mercedes models. It's positioned right there behind that up paddle. At the bottom of the steering wheel, we find some additional buttons and some additional LCDs. This one controls the suspension mode. In this vehicle, we have the optional adaptive suspension, so we have Comfort, Sport, Sport Plus right there. This one toggles between drive and manual mode, and this one allows you to change the drive mode via the steering wheel. You can press and get the individual mode, or you can rotate around for various drive modes. Above that, we have the controls for the cruise control system on the left side. Again, the controls for that LCD instrument cluster. Volume and infotainment controls over here on the right side. This model does not have adaptive cruise control. Out on the road, 0 to 60 happens in 4.7 seconds. That's pretty similar to the M Performance version of the 2 Series Grand Coupe and the Cadillac CTS-V. I'm sorry, the Cadillac CT4V, because of course Cadillac has renamed their entire lineup. Instead of CTS and ATS, etc., we now have CT4 and CT5. And CT4 is theoretically the model that's competing directly with this. Of course, the Cadillac is going to be different than this because it's a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so it is going to feel a little bit different out on the road. But what's really intriguing about the A35 and the CLA35 for that matter is how well Mercedes has masked the fact that this is based on a front-wheel drive vehicle. This doesn't have a mechanical torque vectoring system. Instead, it has one of their brake-based systems. But this has a really incredible feel to it. This feels like it's absolutely on rails. The amount of grip that we get from just 235 with tires is really incredible. This is about 550 pounds lighter than a Mercedes-Benz C43 AMG, and that really shows out on the road. This has just a really great nimble feel to it. That also shows in the stopping distance. It took just 105 feet for this model to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is definitely very, very short. That's BMW M3 short. If you're of the opinion that a vehicle based around a front-wheel drive platform with a 4-cylinder engine just can't be fun out on the road, you need to drive an A35 or a CLA35. These are just an absolute blast to drive. The 7-speed DCT is still not my favorite dual-clutch transmission, especially in slow and go and stop and go traffic. It can feel a little bit herky-jerky, but it is significantly better than the first generation of this 7-speed DCT that we saw in the original CLA. I'm not exactly clear what Mercedes has done. It's probably mainly software, but this is definitely swifter with the shifts, smoother with the shifts, and better in stop and go and slow and go traffic. But it is still not going to be as smooth as some of the alternatives that use traditional automatic transmissions. And that would of course be the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe or the Cadillac. Perhaps the most amazing thing about the A35 and the CLA35 is how Mercedes has managed to tune the entire drivetrain to make this feel an awful lot more nimble and lighter on its feet than you might otherwise think. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of a grown-up Honda Civic Type R. This is an awful lot of fun. The steering wheel is really well sorted. It has a nice quick ratio, but it doesn't feel twitchy. And everything about the CLA has a very solid feel to it. Now, rather unfortunately, I do have to say that perhaps because this suspension is so firm, there are a few squeaks and rattles in this cabin, and that's something that I hadn't expected with only about 4,000 miles on the clock. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, you'll certainly notice the firmness of the A35 suspension tune. As with most of the AMG lineup, obviously this is going to be firmer than the regular versions of the A-Class, but the firmness of the suspension combined with the really low profile tires means that you feel absolutely every pebble on this road. I'm honestly going to have to drop the score down from what I gave the CLA 35. I gave that one a B-. I'm going to have to give this a C+ when it comes to the ride quality. Although I think that this is an okay mix if you live in suburbia and you're driving on relatively normal road surfaces. If you live in an area of the country with really poor roads, definitely a large number of American cities fall into that category, then you might want to think twice about getting this vehicle. And I would certainly recommend getting the adaptive suspension system because it is going to soften things out a little bit. If you live in any of those areas where the roads are a little bit rougher, I would get the C-Class AMG because I think its ride quality is better than this. It soaks up some of these larger and smaller imperfections a little bit better. It's just a little bit more daily driver livable. Of course, the counterpoint to that is that the suspension tune and the really low profile tires are absolutely key to this vehicle's handling ability. Back out on the paved road, it's obvious that this suspension tune is certainly more designed for paved surfaces, but again, you can still feel all of those smaller imperfections into the cabin. You can also hear them. Cabin noise is on the high side for a vehicle in this luxury category, and that did surprise me. We actually got a slightly higher cabin noise score in here than I did in the CLA 35. This came in at 73 decibels, so this is louder than the ILX, the UX, pretty much everything else that you might want to compare this to. One of the things that I liked about the Cadillac CT4 is that its ride was fairly well composed, and even though I do my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, it's worth noting that at 70 or 75 miles an hour, this is significantly louder in the cabin than something like the CT4. On the flip side, fuel economy is absolutely excellent. Over a week of mixed driving, and I have been driving this hard because it is so much fun to drive, I've been averaging 29 miles per gallon. That's about 2 mpg above the EPA score. One thing that I've noted before is that the Mercedes-Benz 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo and this 7-speed DCT are incredibly efficient. Even though this has a 4-wheel drive system that is really sending an awful lot of power to the rear axle, and it certainly has an eye on performance. Bottom line, out on the road, the A35 is just an absolute blast to drive. Now let's dive into the pricing. The A-Class is the least expensive Mercedes available in the United States. It starts at $33,650. All-wheel drive is a $2,000 option. And the A-Class AMG is the least expensive AMG you can buy in America as well. It's going to be considerably more expensive, however, starting at $45,850. As with most Mercedes models in America, keep in mind that there are a ton of options and ways to customize your A-Class, and that will jack up the price if you start getting carried away with some of those options. As tested today, this model was $57,890, and that definitely is well into the price range of a wide number of different Mercedes models and a wide number of competitors. On the other hand, that is $2,000 less expensive than the CLA 35, which is the sexier version of the A-Class. That's the best way to think about it. Mercedes calls it a 4-door coupe, but it really is a sedan with just some slightly changed windows and a slightly different roofline. At least for the moment, there's no A45 in the United States. There is a CLA 45, so if you want that next level of performance in a very similar package, you can move over to the CLA lineup. And there's no A-Class hatchback. The A45 hatch is a European-only vehicle, at least for now, but it is the ultimate high-performance hot hatch. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition. The first competitor, and the most direct competitor for 2021, has to be the BMW 2 Series Gran Coupe. Even though the 2 Series model shares its name with the 2 Series Coupe and Convertible, it's not the same vehicle at all. This is a front-wheel drive vehicle more closely related to certain vehicles in the Mini lineup, so an awful lot like the A-Class and the CLA. The M235i version of the 2 Series Gran Coupe comes standard with 301 horsepower, 331 pound-feet of torque, an 8-speed automatic. It is a traditional automatic transmission, and the price tag is very similar to the A35 at $45,500. The traditional automatic transmission is a big difference between these two vehicles. The DCT that we find in the Mercedes is going to be slicker shifting, it's going to feel a little bit sportier, a little bit more engaging. But if you're in stop-and-go or slow-and-go traffic, or if you live in a hilly area and you're worried about rolling backwards or rolling forwards when you don't mean to, the traditional automatic transmission may be a better fit for you. Also, there aren't as many options available in the BMW. It goes up to about $55,000, but there aren't as many standalone boxes to check, so many variations as we see in the Mercedes lineup, etc. For some folks, that may be a good thing because you could definitely keep the price tag a little bit more in check than we see with the Mercedes. But on the other hand, if you're looking for that next level in customization, you won't find it in the BMW family. When it comes to driving dynamics, I think the A-Class is a little bit sharper than the BMW. I like the BMW, don't get me wrong, but the A-Class is just a little bit more fun to drive out on the road. Then, of course, we have the Audi A3. But the important thing to keep in mind is that the A3 is getting completely redesigned for 2022. And a lot of the details are not quite final. We know that the next generation S3, which is going to be the direct competitor to the A35, is going to produce over 300 horsepower. Current estimates put that at 306. It's also going to have all-wheel drive and a dual clutch transmission, so very much like we see in the Mercedes. But the Audi DCTs tend to be more polished than the older 7-speed designs that we find in the Mercedes lineup. The newer Mercedes-AMG products with their 8-speed DCT are really, really well done, but the 7-speed DCT in the A35 and some of the other models don't have the level of polish we find in most modern Audi DCTs. The only other option really in this subcompact sedan segment, and that is a bit of a stretch here, is going to be the Cadillac CT4V. The problem, or the asset to the CT4V, depending on how you want to look at this, is that on the outside it's a compact sedan, on the inside it's a subcompact sedan. That's because the CT4 really is the last generation Cadillac ATS that's been poked and prodded and refreshed here and there and had a new name applied, and a much lower sticker price. Cadillac realized that the ATS and CTS weren't as competitive as they would like them to be. They were a little bit small and tight on the inside, and they were about the same price as their direct competition. So what they decided to do for 2020 and 2021 is to shrink the price tag and rename them, and then retarget the competition a little bit. So the ATS theoretically was a BMW 3 Series Mercedes-Benz C-Class competitor. It was similarly priced, but tight on the inside. However, when you take a look at the CT4 now and the CT4V, it's priced like a CLA or an A-Class and sized like a CLA or an A-Class on the inside, so this makes an awful lot more sense. But the key here is the price tag, because it's now priced like an A-Class. As a result, when it comes to driving dynamics, handling feel, and just the way the vehicle feels out on the road, the CT4V is my preference in this segment. But it is going to feel heavier than the CLA and the A-Class. It is a bigger vehicle on the outside, and indeed it is heavier, especially in the top trims. If you're specifically looking for something based on size, then the CT4 is not really going to be a direct competitor. But if you're simply shopping based on price, then the CT4V is an absolutely excellent bargain. 0 to 60 acceleration is excellent. You can get all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive, so you don't need to have all-wheel drive if you don't want it. If you want that rear-wheel drive vibe, that rear-wheel drive dynamic, then you can get it in the Cadillac. And you cannot get that in the A3 or the 235i or, of course, the CLA or A. I suspect if I were shopping in this segment based on price, not on size, I would get the CT4, probably in the premium luxury trim, which would get you that 2.7-liter twin-turbo 6, but in a slightly lower tune. I like the interior a little bit more in the regular CT4 versus the CT4V. Also keep in mind there are a ton of deals on the Cadillac dealer lot, so it's likely going to be a lot less expensive than the A35. But I don't think that the CT4 and CT4V are the biggest direct competitors to the A35. I would actually say that's probably going to be the C-Class. The least expensive C-Class AMG starts at $57,890, suspiciously really similar to the A35 that I was driving today. Now, the one problem with this comparison, of course, is that we're talking about a base model versus an A35 with a decent number of options on it. Again, the model that I was driving this week started at $45,850, ended up at $57,890. But on the other hand, you'd be driving a C-Class, not an A-Class, and there is a definite perceived prestige in driving the more expensive model. I also prefer the driving dynamics of the C-Class to the A-Class. It's going to have a traditional automatic transmission, it's going to feel a little bit bigger, a little bit more grown-up. Handling in some situations may actually be better with the A35 AMG because it's a smaller, lighter vehicle, but I prefer the driving dynamics and just the overall feel of the C-Class a little bit more than the A35. I suspect if my money were on the line and I was on the Mercedes dealer lot, that I would probably get something like a mid-level trim of the C300 in rear-wheel drive form. I like the rear-wheel drive dynamics a little bit more than the all-wheel drive system that we find in the A35. And sure, it's not an AMG model, so not quite a direct competitor here. Obviously, it will be slower, but I think that's the direction that I would probably go in. Now, if I were restricted to the subcompact segment, or a theoretical subcompact segment, I would say, then I would be pretty hard-pressed between the A35, the CLA 35, which I think is, valid to compare here because it's just a different look really for you, and something like the Cadillac CT4V or CT4 Premium Luxury. Admittedly, it's not quite the same thing because it is a bigger vehicle, but it's priced very much like the A35. I love the rear-wheel drive dynamics, and I love the fact that Cadillac decided to finally drop the price tag on this. When it was an ATS, I wasn't that big of a fan, but I've always liked the way this vehicle drives out on the road. And so by refocusing it on a less expensive segment, calling it that A35 competitor and stuffing one of their newer engines and new transmission under the hood, it makes an awful lot of sense. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. Would you get an A35 or would you take a look at something like that CT4V? Let me know down there. Be sure and check out the merch store at aoamerch.com. You can buy a wide variety of t-shirts like the ones that are on the wall behind me. And of course, find me over at facebook.com. I'll see all of you later.